let's talk about the next case, which I think is also, really terrifying and part of a long-term sort of project to return us to the Lochner era. That is the EPA versus West Virginia, or West Virginia versus the EPA. And this is the doctrine at stake here is sort of a cousin to the chevron doctrine on some level, and that is the major questions doctrine. And before we even get into that, this is also another example of a case that the Supreme Court does not need to even hear, right? Because my understanding is this is it's an Obama era regulation that never went into effect. The Biden administration is going to propose a new rule, a different one. So there's no case here, really, right?
There is currently no EPA regulation limiting carbon at coal-fired power plants. And this case is explicitly about the legality of an EPA regulation limiting carbon at power plants. There is no controversy. There is no rule to strike down. There is nothing for the Supreme Court to actually do except to tell the Biden administration, don't even try regulating greenhouse gases, because if you do, we will step in immediately and shut you down. The immediate impact of this case will be nothing because, like you said, there is simply no regulation for the court to even invalidate.
And generally, it's been the case that the court says, like, well, since there's no controversy and since this will have only hypothetical implications going forward, we don't know what the Biden administration is going to propose. We wouldn't handle this case unless we basically want to say, hey, the whole way that you've been doing government for the past 90 years, yeah, that's changing now.
Yes. I mean, and that language comes from the Constitution, which says that the Supreme Court can only decide a case or controversy. And so the idea of resolving hypothetical future disputes is really anathema to judicial review. But, the conservative justices don't care anymore.
Judicial pre-review. And yeah. Do you see that this is going to, frankly, what it seems to me that there's going to be a lot more cases in the coming year that are targeting preemptively regulations from the Biden administration.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you followed the social cost of carbon case, but this was a recent example of what you just described, Emma, where Biden convened this working group that was going to figure out basically the externalities of carbon. How much does it cost society and humans and the earth per ton of carbon? And eventually the results of that group were going to be factored into regulations. But this was just a bunch of eggheads working together on Zoom. And a Trump judge issued a nationwide injunction blocking the existence of that working group because he said that they would eventually produce a result that would hurt states that produce fossil fuels.
That's bat crap crazy. I hadn't heard about that. That's absolutely nuts. That's absolutely. You're going to enjoin the government from doing research?
Yes, that is literally what this court did. Now, thankfully, the Fifth Circuit actually stepped in and reversed that judge because it was a rare, sane panel of the Fifth Circuit. It was not crazy Trump judges.
All right, I just want people to understand this. When you have a circuit court, there's usually 11 justices on it?
More than that.
Okay.
To, 15,
they sometimes
20.
they have right, 20. Okay. And when they hear a case like that, they'll have a panel of 3 judges who are picked out of a hat, more or less, or are they assigned? And they make a decision. If you luck out, and on the Fifth Circuit, the vast majority of them are George W. Bush and Trump judges. But if you luck out and get an Obama justice and a Clinton justice, and then maybe a George W. Bush justice or a Trump justice, you could win that case 2-3. It could theoretically go en banc to the whole and get reversed there. But so what is happening with this EPA West Virginia case? It centers around the major questions doctrine, but that's just a made up doctrine that doesn't mean anything.
Right. So the major questions doctrine is Brett Kavanaugh's baby. He birthed it while on the DC circuit, and he is trying to make it a real thing on the Supreme Court. And it's this idea that when an agency regulates something that presents a major question of what? Of law, of the economy, of society, just a big question that you have to think really hard about, then courts should probably strike it down unless Congress authorized it in bold and italics and all caps within the last 6 months. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's basically the gist here, that unless Congress has said in terms explicit enough to satisfy Brett Kavanaugh that some kind of regulation is kosher, then the Supreme Court and the lower court should strike it down, which completely reverses the normal way that these cases are processed, which is that you assume an agency has expertise enough and is, following the law enough to actually apply Congress's wishes unless you see evidence to the contrary. So it is a recipe for a transfer of power from the executive branch, from all of these federal agencies that are answerable to the president, to unelected federal judges who have no constituents and no elections and whom we can never vote out of office.
And I would also add, as you touched on, there's no metric in which to even assess whether what they did was even consistent with their own rules, because major question is exactly as vague as it sounds. We don't know if it crosses the threshold, if it involves a third of the economy, a quarter of the economy, 5% of the economy, 2% of the economy, or if it deals with a number of people, or if it deals with life and death, or maybe just injury or not injury, or just it could literally be anything at that point. And just to remind people, this is sort of like a part of the whole non-delegation idea where Congress doesn't know what poisons are in the air. They're not scientists. They in charge the EPA to say what poisons are in the air. And how do you determine poison is by looking at studies and saying, if I have too much of this, I die. If I don't, if I have however many microns per whatever it is, I die. And if not, then I live. That's what constitutes poison in the air. These are all questions that Congress could never, ever establish on their own, because they're not out there taking air samples every day and then running tests on whether or not this is healthy for people.
Right. Congress does not know exactly how many molecules of mercury are safe to be in the drinking water. And similarly, when Congress passed the Clean Air Act and a bunch of amendments to the Clean Air Act, they didn't know which emissions exactly were going to harm human health and welfare. So they said, look, EPA, figure out which emissions are harming humans and the earth and come up with a way to limit them. That's what the Clean Air Act says. That's what the EPA would like to do with carbon. But it seems probable that the Supreme Court's conservatives will step in and say, well, Congress didn't use the word carbon, and so you are not allowed to regulate it until Congress specifically comes in and gives you metrics, which of course Congress is not going to do for a very long time, if ever. So this whole idea, non-delegation, major questions, it's just a backdoor way for the Supreme Court to exploit congressional gridlock and ensure that we do not have the many regulations that are necessary to keep our government running and to keep our society healthy.
If Kavanaugh invented this at the DC Circuit level, there's nothing inhibiting any of the subsidiary courts to make their own decisions as to what constitutes a major question.
That's right. And they can also make up new doctrines if those don't fit the bill and just float them and see what works and what doesn't. They're throwing it all against the wall. Some of it's going to stick at this court.
And this is I'm old enough to remember, 5 or 6 years ago when it was decades of activist judges this, activist judges that. And to be clear, activist judges, to the extent that even exists as a concept, really can only be measured how much authority are you taking from elected officials, essentially.
Yes. And the answer is a whole hell of a lot at this Supreme Court. And at least 5 of the 6 aren't even bashful about it. I think they enjoy taking this power and kind of reveling in it. And they don't even pretend to show judicial restraint or modesty. They think we're the kings, we got these jobs fair and square, and we're the ones who run the country now.
And just a quick point, the process by which they were nominated also emboldens them, because there is an understanding by the Republican Party that this is their last stand. This is the Supreme Court is going to be a way to stave off progress in every which way. And so that kind of emboldens them to be activists and not apologize for it. Plus, like, the whole lifetime appointment thing.
Yeah, which no other country does. Every other country thinks we're crazy for giving mortal human beings a lifetime of absolute power. But that's a conversation for another day.